Most people think American cities look the way they do by accident, that they simply grew this way over time. But the truth is, almost nothing about American cities is accidental. From wide roads, empty downtowns, endless parking lots, to cities built for cars instead of people. This video is part of our series on why American cities look the way they do. And once you understand the system behind it, you'll never see American cities the same way again.
At first glance, American cities look powerful. Tall skylines, endless roads, vast neighborhoods stretching to the horizon. But when you slow down, something feels missing. Streets that move cars, not people. Downtowns that empty after 5 p.m. Public spaces designed to pass through, not stay in. This isn't an accident. The emptiness you feel was designed, shaped by history, policy, economics, and a very specific idea of freedom. To understand why American cities feel empty, we have to rewind 100 years, to the moment the city stopped being a place to live and became a system to move through.
The American city before cars took over. Long before American cities felt empty, they were crowded in a very different way. Not crowded with traffic, not crowded with parking structures, but crowded with life. In the early 20th century, the American city was not something you passed through. It was something you inhabited. People lived near where they worked. Shops sat beneath apartments. Streets were not corridors for speed, but stages for daily life. Children played near storefronts. Neighbors recognized each other by face, not by license plate. To understand why modern American cities feel empty, we must first understand what they used to be. The pre-automobile city was dense by necessity. Density in early American cities was not an ideological choice, it was a practical one. Before cars, distance had a cost measured in time and effort. Walking was the default mode of transportation. Streetcars and rail lines extended reach, but only along fixed corridors. This meant cities grew compact and layered, not spread out. Housing clustered near jobs. Shops lined daily walking routes. Civic buildings anchored neighborhoods. Streets carried people, animals, carts, and conversations all at once. The city was built to minimize friction between daily needs. In places like New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, entire neighborhoods functioned as self-contained urban ecosystems. You could live, work, shop, socialize, and worship within a few blocks. Urban design did not separate life into zones, it mixed them. Streets were social infrastructure. In the early American city, streets were not just infrastructure. They were public space. A street was where merchants displayed goods, news traveled by word of mouth, political ideas circulated, communities negotiated shared norms. Movement was slow enough to allow interaction. There was no sharp distinction between traffic and people. The street belonged to everyone. This mattered deeply for social cohesion. When people encounter each other repeatedly at the same corners, storefronts, and stoops, trust forms, informal accountability develops, community becomes visible. Urban sociologists later called this eyes on the street, but at the time it was simply how cities worked. Downtowns were not office districts. Another critical difference, downtowns were not single-purpose employment centers. They were mixed-use cores. Yes, businesses operated there, but people also lived there. Entertainment, housing, retail, services, and civic life overlapped. After work hours, downtowns did not empty, they transformed. Restaurants filled, theaters lit up, streets remained active. There was no sharp line between day city and night city. The idea that a city center should shut down after 5 p.m. would have seemed irrational. The city was designed for human scale. Buildings were rarely isolated, they met the sidewalk directly, entrances faced the street, windows watched the public realm. This created what urban historians describe as human-scale design. Short blocks encouraged walking, frequent intersections increased choice, ground floor activity provided visual interest, streets felt enclosed, not exposed. The city wrapped around people rather than scattering them. Even large cities felt navigable because movement was incremental and legible. You always knew where you were, not by signage, but by context. The cultural meaning of density was different. Today, density in the United States is often framed as a problem, crowding, noise, congestion. But in the early 20th century, density carried a different meaning. It represented opportunity.
Cities were magnets for immigrants, laborers, entrepreneurs, and artists because proximity enabled upward mobility. Being close to others meant access to jobs, access to markets, access to information, access to culture. Density compressed chance encounters, and chance encounters generate innovation. American cities became engines of economic growth precisely because they forced interaction. Transportation shaped form, but slowly. Even as streetcars and elevated trains expanded urban reach, they did not destroy density, they structured it. Development clustered along transit lines, neighborhoods formed around stations. This produced what planners later called transit-oriented development long before the term existed. Importantly, transportation infrastructure did not dominate urban space, it supported it. Rail lines were integrated, stations were civic landmarks, not barriers. Movement enhanced place instead of replacing it. Early warning signs were already present. Even in this era, tensions existed. Industrial pollution, overcrowded tenements, unequal access to services. Reformers pushed for sanitation, housing standards, and urban parks, but their goal was not to dismantle the city, it was to improve it. No one was proposing to spread cities apart.
The assumption remained, cities are where life happens. The city as a collective project. Perhaps the most important difference was philosophical. Early American cities were understood as collective systems. Shared streets, shared transit, shared public spaces. Private property existed, but it was embedded within a shared urban framework. Daily life required negotiation with others. That friction was not seen as a failure. It was accepted as the cost and benefit of living together. What was about to change? This entire urban logic depended on one fragile condition: limited personal mobility. Once that limitation disappeared, the incentives that shaped cities would reverse. When movement becomes effortless, proximity loses its power. When distance feels free, spread becomes rational. The American city was about to encounter a technology that did not just change transportation, it changed values. And when values change, cities follow.
The invention that changed everything. How the automobile rewired the American city. The transformation of American cities did not begin with a plan. It began with a promise. The automobile arrived not as an urban policy, but as a symbol. A machine that offered speed, privacy, and freedom. Three ideas that would quietly redefine how Americans understood space itself. At first, the car was not meant to replace the city. It was meant to enhance it. But technology rarely stops where intention ends. The car did not enter an empty city. When automobiles first appeared in American cities in the early 20th century, they entered environments never designed for them. Streets were narrow. Intersections were frequent. Pedestrians, streetcars, wagons, and vendors all shared the same space. Early cars moved slowly, often no faster than a horse-drawn carriage. They were loud, unreliable, and expensive. Yet they carried an invisible advantage. They untethered movement from fixed routes. Unlike streetcars, cars did not need tracks. Unlike trains, they did not require stations. They promised point-to-point travel, door to door. That single capability would overturn centuries of urban logic. Freedom, redefined as distance. In American culture, freedom has always carried a spatial dimension. The frontier myth framed land as liberation, ownership as independence, separation as self-reliance. The automobile fused these cultural values with everyday mobility. Suddenly, distance no longer represented inconvenience, it represented choice. You could live farther away, work farther apart, shop without walking, escape the crowd without abandoning the city entirely. This reframing mattered more than speed. The car transformed how Americans evaluated space. Nearness stopped being necessary. Farness stopped being costly. Streets began to change their purpose. As car ownership increased, conflict followed. Accidents rose. Pedestrians were injured and killed at alarming rates. Children playing in the street were reframed as hazards rather than participants. Instead of questioning the compatibility of cars and cities, the response was to redefine the street. Legal and design systems shifted responsibility away from drivers and toward pedestrians. The term jaywalker was popularized, not as a neutral description, but as a moral judgment. The message was subtle but powerful. Streets were no longer shared public space. They were transportation corridors. People became obstacles. Engineering replaced urbanism. As cars multiplied, cities turned to engineers for solutions. Engineers optimized for speed, throughput, flow. Urban planners had once asked how cities should feel. Engineers asked how fast vehicles could move. This distinction reshaped everything. Roads widened. Intersections simplified. Curbs hardened boundaries between movement and place. Design standards began to prioritize the fastest possible user, the car. And because cars require space, that space had to come from somewhere. Sidewalks shrank. Buildings retreated. Public life thinned. The rise of parking has urban form. Perhaps no element reshaped American cities more quietly than parking. Cars spend most of their lives stationary. Cities had to accommodate this. Parking lots, garages, and curbside storage consumed land that once held homes, shops, and public spaces. Downtowns were punctured by empty asphalt. Street walls were broken. Walking distances increased. Importantly, parking was framed as a necessity, not a choice. Zoning codes mandated minimum parking requirements, embedding car dependency directly into law. Urban space was no longer designed around people. It was designed around vehicles at rest. The psychological shift. As cities adjusted to cars, perception changed. Density began to feel inefficient. Proximity began to feel unnecessary. Crowds began to feel inconvenient. The car offered control. You controlled your route, your temperature, your music, your encounters. Public life, once unavoidable, became optional. This shift did not destroy cities overnight. It hollowed them out gradually. When interaction becomes avoidable, social bonds weaken without anyone noticing. Suburbs were not an accident. The automobile did not create suburbs by itself, but it made them viable at scale. Low-density development could now function because daily life no longer required closeness. Homes spread out. Land uses separated. Distances grew. Suburbs promised space, quiet, and perceived safety, while remaining economically tied to cities. This arrangement appeared efficient, but it depended entirely on continuous mobility. The city ceased to be a lived-in environment. It became a destination, a place you traveled to, not a place you belonged. Transit became secondary. As cars dominated, public transit declined. Streetcar lines were dismantled or underfunded. Investment shifted toward highways and arterial roads.
Transit lost frequency, coverage, and prestige. What had once been a shared civic system became a last resort for those without cars. This reinforced the cycle. Less transit meant more cars. More cars meant cities designed even more around driving. Choice narrowed, even as freedom was celebrated. A new urban equation. By mid-century, the equation had flipped. Instead of designing cities first and fitting transportation into them, America designed transportation systems and reshaped cities to accommodate them. The automobile was no longer a tool within the city. The city became a tool for the automobile. This inversion explains much of what followed. Emptiness was not caused by neglect. It was the logical outcome of a system optimized for movement rather than presence. What was lost was not density, it was friction. The car did not just remove people from streets, it removed the need to encounter others. Friction, once the generator of community, became a problem to be engineered away. But cities without friction do not feel alive. They feel efficient, and efficiency by itself does not create meaning. Zoning the city apart. How law turned separation into the American default. By the time the automobile had proven its power, American cities faced a choice. They could adapt carefully, or they could codify change into law. They chose law. What began as a technological shift soon hardened into a legal framework that would permanently reshape American urban life. This framework was zoning. Zoning was sold as order. Early 20th century American cities were chaotic by modern standards. Factories sat near homes. Shops operated below apartments. Noise, smoke, and congestion coexisted with daily life. Reformers believed the city could be improved through rational organization. Zoning promised clarity. Separate the noisy from the quiet, the dangerous from the domestic, the commercial from the residential. On paper, it sounded humane. But zoning did not simply organize cities, it segregated functions. The first comprehensive zoning laws. New York City passed the first comprehensive zoning resolution in 1916. Its goal was modest: prevent massive buildings from blocking light and air. But the idea spread quickly. By the 1920s, zoning codes across the country began to regulate land use, building height, density, setbacks, lot coverage. Cities were no longer organic systems, they became regulatory diagrams. And once separation was introduced, it expanded. Single-use zoning changed everything. The most influential and damaging innovation was single-use zoning. Residential zones for housing, commercial zones for business, industrial zones for factories. This broke the mixed-use fabric that had defined American cities for generations. Daily life was no longer arranged around proximity, it was arranged around compliance. If you wanted to shop, you traveled. If you wanted to work, you commuted. If you wanted to socialize, you scheduled. The street lost its role as connector. Movement replaced presence. Cars made separation seem logical. Without automobiles, strict separation would have been unworkable. With cars, it felt efficient. Distance no longer mattered. Time could be compressed by speed. Zoning and automobiles reinforced each other. Zoning created distance. Cars erased its inconvenience. This feedback loop rewarded sprawl and punished density. The death of the corner store. One of the quiet casualties of zoning was the neighborhood shop. Small stores once thrived because they served local foot traffic. Zoning codes often banned commercial activity in residential areas. This forced commerce into centralized corridors and malls. Neighborhoods lost daily destinations. Walking lost its purpose. Without reason to be on the street, social life retreated in Mars. The city did not become empty overnight, it became inactive. Density became a legal problem. Zoning codes did not simply separate uses, they capped density. Minimum lot sizes, height limits, setback requirements. These rules made compact development illegal in vast areas of American cities. Even when demand existed, density could not respond. The housing supply became rigid. Scarcity followed. What we now call the housing crisis is not just economic, it is regulatory. The suburban template becomes law. Single-family zoning became the dominant residential category. Entire cities reserved most of their land for detached homes only. Apartments were restricted to narrow zones, mixed-use buildings were prohibited. This was not a market outcome, it was a legal mandate. The result was predictable. Cities spread outward instead of upward. Land consumption exploded. Infrastructure costs rose. And emptiness increased. Zoning as social filter. Zoning was not neutral. By controlling what could be built, it controlled who could live where. Large lots and single-family homes raised costs. Lower-income residents were priced out. While zoning language avoided explicit exclusion, its effects were clear. Cities became economically and socially stratified. Public life fragmented along class lines. When people did not share space, empathy arose. Downtowns hollowed from the inside. As housing was pushed outward, downtowns became job centers only. Offices replaced homes. Workers arrived in the morning and left at night. After business hours, activity collapsed. Restaurants survived only where they could capture commuters. Small retail struggled. Downtown emptiness was not cultural failure. It was functional design. Planning for separation, not interaction. Zoning trained planners to think in categories, not relationships. Housing here. Work there. Leisure somewhere else. The city was no longer a continuous experience. It was a sequence of destinations. Streets became connectors between isolated pods. Public space lost its audience. The long shadow of zoning. Once written, zoning codes proved difficult to change. Homeowners benefited from scarcity. Local governments relied on property tax stability.
The system locked itself in. What began as a response to industrial chaos became a machine that produced spatial isolation. And isolation feels like emptiness. The hidden cost. Zoning did not just reshape land, it reshaped time. Daily life became scheduled around movement. Spontaneity declined. Chance encounters vanished. Cities lost the texture that once made them feel alive.
Highways through the heart of the city. How infrastructure physically emptied American urban cores. Zoning separated the American city on paper. Highways separated it in concrete. By the mid-20th century, the automobile had already reshaped daily life. But what came next would permanently alter the physical structure of American cities and erase entire neighborhoods in the process. This was not an unintended consequence. It was national policy. The Federal Highway Act changed everything. In 1956, the United States passed the Federal Aid Highway Act. It authorized the construction of over 40,000 miles of interstate highways, the largest public works project in American history. The stated goals were national defense, economic efficiency, and modern mobility, but the impact on cities was profound. Highways did not simply connect cities, they cut through them. Why highways went through cities? Routing highways through dense urban areas was not inevitable, but it was politically convenient. Urban land was cheaper to acquire through eminent domain. Displacement fell disproportionately on communities with less political power. Downtown routes also maximized access for suburban commuters. The logic was simple. Cities would sacrifice space so cars could move faster. People were not the priority. Neighborhoods were treated as obstacles. Entire districts were labeled blighted to justify demolition. Often, these neighborhoods were vibrant, walkable, and socially dense, home to working-class communities, immigrants, and Black Americans. Highways carved through residential blocks, commercial streets, cultural centers. What remained were fragments, isolated on either side of roaring traffic. Community networks collapsed overnight. Physical barriers create social barriers. Highways are not just roads, they are walls. Wide rights of way, limited crossings, high-speed traffic. They severed pedestrian connections and fractured urban continuity. Neighborhoods once linked by walking were now separated by danger and noise. Local businesses lost foot traffic. Public spaces lost coherence. What could not be reached on foot stopped being part of daily life. Downtowns became transit zones, not places. Highways fed directly into downtown cores. This turned city centers into nodes of arrival and departure. Parking structures replaced buildings. Interchanges consumed land. Surface lots filled the gaps. Downtowns optimized for peak hours, not continuous life. When the workday ended, the flow reversed. People left. Silence followed. Urban renewal accelerated the damage. Highway construction was paired with urban renewal programs. The promise was modernization. Old buildings were cleared. Obsolete neighborhoods removed. New development promised efficiency. But renewal often failed to replace what it destroyed. Vacant land lingered. Large-scale projects lacked human scale. What was lost was not just housing, it was memory. The scale problem. Highways introduced a new scale into cities. Designed for speed, they required long ramps, wide curves, large clear zones. This scale overwhelmed the fine-grained fabric of older neighborhoods. Human movement slowed, distances felt longer, spaces felt harsher, cities stopped feeling intimate. Noise, pollution, and retreat. Living near highways carried costs: noise, air pollution, visual intrusion. Those who could afford to move did. Those who remained faced declining conditions. This accelerated suburban flight and deepened inequality. The emptiness of cities was not evenly distributed. It followed lines of power. The psychological effect of division. Highways taught people to experience the city at speed. You passed over neighborhoods without entering them. You learned routes, not places. This reduced the city to a series of exits. Presence gave way to navigation. And when a city is experienced primarily through windshields, it loses emotional depth. Infrastructure as destiny. Once built, highways were permanent. They locked in patterns of commuting, land use, and investment. Public transit struggled to compete. Walkability deteriorated. Cities adapted to infrastructure rather than shaping it. Emptiness became structural. What highways took with them? Highways did more than cars moved. They removed density, continuity, neighborhood life, economic diversity. What replaced them was not efficiency alone. It was absence. The Suburban Promise. Why emptiness felt like success in post-war America. By the time highways reached deep into the American landscape, the city was no longer the primary dream. The dream had moved outward. What replaced density was not chaos or decline. It was something far more appealing. Space. Silence. Separation. The suburbs did not rise as an accident or a mistake. They rose as a promise, carefully marketed, politically supported, and culturally reinforced. And for millions of Americans, that promise felt like progress. The post-war moment changed everything. After World War II, the United States entered a unique historical window. Industrial capacity surged, wages rose, federal programs expanded access to home ownership. Returning soldiers wanted stability, families wanted privacy, the nation wanted normalcy. The dense, aging city no longer symbolized opportunity. It symbolized congestion, conflict, and constraint. The suburb offered an alternative vision.
Homeownership as national policy. Federal housing programs did more than support families. They reshaped geography. Mortgage guarantees favored new construction over older urban housing. Large-scale suburban developments received financing denied to inner cities. Owning a detached home became not just a lifestyle choice, but a civic ideal. The single-family house represented independence, security, moral success. Density, by contrast, was framed as temporary, something to escape. The economics of spread. Suburbs were cheaper to build per unit. Land was abundant. Regulations were flexible. Infrastructure costs were deferred or subsidized. Developers could replicate the same model endlessly. This made suburban growth appear efficient, even as it consumed enormous resources. The cost was hidden. Cities absorbed the long-term burden of maintenance. Taxpayers funded roads, utilities, and services stretched across distance. Emptiness was not free, it was subsidized. Privacy became a design principle. In suburban design, separation was intentional. Homes were set back from the street. Garages faced outward. Fences marked boundaries. Public life receded. Interaction became optional rather than inevitable. You could go days without encountering a neighbor unless you chose to. This was framed as comfort. But it fundamentally altered social rhythms. Streets lost their purpose. Suburban streets were not designed for staying, they were designed for access. Curving roads discouraged through traffic, but also discouraged walking. Cul-de-sacs reduced movement. There was no reason to linger. Without destinations, streets emptied. The absence of people was not a failure of design. It was the design. The shopping mall replaced the main street. As daily commerce left neighborhoods, it consolidated. Shopping malls offered controlled environments. Climate-controlled, car-accessible, privately managed. They mimicked public space without the unpredictability of real public life. This further weakened urban centers. Local shops closed. Downtown retail declined. Economic activity followed parking availability rather than foot traffic. The cultural narrative shifted. Media reinforced the suburban ideal. Television depicted spacious homes and quiet streets as markers of success. Cities were portrayed as places of danger or struggle. The message was clear. To succeed was to leave. Emptiness became aspirational. Suburbs redefined community. Community no longer formed through proximity. It formed through similarity. Income. Lifestyle. Car ownership. This reduced exposure to difference. Public space lost its role as a shared arena. The city, once a place of encounter, became a place of avoidance. The commuter compromise. Suburbs depended on cities for employment and culture. But they rejected urban life itself. The commute bridged this contradiction. Highways allowed people to extract value from cities without participating in them. Cities provided jobs. Suburbs absorbed people. Downtown hollowed further. Success measured in absence. The quieter the street, the safer it felt. The larger the lot, the higher the status. Emptiness became a feature, not a flaw. Few stopped to ask what was being lost. The absence of noise also meant the absence of vitality. The absence of crowds also meant the absence of connection. The long-term trade-off. The Suburban Promise delivered comfort, but at a cost. Car dependency locked households into rising transportation expenses. Social isolation increased. Public investment fragmented. Cities lost residents, tax base, and political influence. What remained were structures designed for people who were no longer there. Emptiness became normal.
Streets without people. Downtowns without residents. Public spaces without public life. This was not decay.
It was the fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier.
Downtowns without residents. How office-centric cities erased everyday life. By the late 20th century, the American city had settled into a new role. It was no longer a place to live, it was a place to arrive. Downtowns, once dense mixtures of housing, commerce, and culture, had been reorganized around a single function: work. This transformation did not happen because people stopped wanting to live in cities. It happened because cities were redesigned to make living there difficult. The rise of the central business district. As residents moved outward, offices moved inward. Downtown land became valuable not for its livability, but for its accessibility. Proximity to highways, proximity to rail hubs, proximity to corporate power. Zoning reinforced this specialization. Large areas of downtown were designated for commercial use only. Housing was restricted, discouraged, or priced out. The city center became a machine for productivity. The 9-to-5 city. Office-centric downtowns operate on a strict rhythm. Morning influx, daytime intensity, evening exodus. This cycle shapes everything. Restaurants cater to lunch crowds. Retail depends on weekday traffic. Public spaces are busiest when people are passing through, not staying. After hours, the city empties. Not because nothing exists, but because no one lives there. Why residential life was pushed out? Living in downtowns became increasingly impractical. Noise from traffic, lack of schools and grocery stores, zoning barriers to housing development. At the same time, suburban living was subsidized and promoted. The market followed incentives. Downtown housing became niche rather than normal. The city lost its most important ingredient: continuity. Public space without public life. Parks, plazas, and sidewalks depend on nearby residents. Without them, public space becomes episodic. Used during lunch breaks, vacant at night, empty on weekends. Design cannot compensate for absence. No amount of beautification can replace people who belong there. Safety through absence, a false logic. Many downtowns responded to emptiness by increasing control. Surveillance, private security, hostile architecture. The goal was safety. But safety without life feels sterile. People sense when a place lacks natural activity. They stay away, reinforcing the cycle. The event city illusion. To compensate, cities turn to events. Festivals, conventions, sports arenas. These injected temporary life into empty cores. But between events, emptiness returned. A city cannot survive on occasional excitement. It needs daily presence. Architecture at the wrong scale. Office towers are designed for efficiency, not intimacy. Large floor plates, minimal street interaction, blank facades. Ground floors often serve lobbies rather than shops. This deadens the street. People pass by without reason to stop. The city becomes visually impressive but emotionally distant. Parking as priority. Even in downtowns, cars dominated. Garages integrated into buildings. Surface lots filled vacant parcels. This reduced density further. Every parking space replaced potential housing. The city center became porous, full of gaps where life should be. The weekend test. The true measure of urban vitality is the weekend. In many American downtowns, weekends reveal emptiness. No commuters, few residents, limited services. This is not a failure of culture, it is a failure of structure. Cities as infrastructure, not habitat. Downtowns came to be understood as infrastructure. They processed workers, they hosted transactions, they facilitated meetings. But they did not support everyday life. When cities stop being habitats, they stop feeling human. The emotional consequence. People sense when a place lacks belonging. Even well-maintained downtowns can feel hollow. Beautiful buildings, clean streets, no warmth. Emptiness is not always visible. Sometimes it is felt. A city that cannot hold you. The American downtown became a place you use, not a place you keep.
Arrive. Work. Leave. Without residence, there is no memory. Without memory, there is no attachment. And without attachment, cities struggle to feel alive.
Why other cities feel different. What American urbanism chose not to do. To understand why American cities feel empty, it helps to leave them. Not physically, but conceptually. When Americans travel to cities in Europe, East Asia, or parts of Latin America, a common reaction emerges. These cities feel alive. Not louder, not denser in every case, but more inhabited. The difference is not cultural temperament, it is structural choice. Density was preserved elsewhere. Many cities around the world modernized without dismantling density. They upgraded infrastructure while retaining compact form. Housing remained central. Daily needs stayed within walking distance. Transit remained the backbone of movement. Cars were accommodated, but not centered. The city remained primarily a place to live. Mixed use was never abandoned. Outside the United States, mixed-use development never disappeared. Shops beneath homes, offices beside apartments. Schools integrated into neighborhoods. Zoning systems allowed overlap rather than separation. This preserved daily street activity. Life did not depend on schedules, it unfolded continuously. Streets stayed human-scaled. In many global cities, streets retained their social function. Narrower widths, slower speeds, frequent crossings. These design choices encourage presence. People linger because the environment allows it. Cars coexist, but they do not dominate. Public transit retained prestige. Transit remained a civic investment, not a fallback. Reliable service, frequent schedules, integrated land use. This reduced car dependency without banning cars. Movement stayed collective. Cities were designed around shared systems rather than individual vehicles. Housing was treated as urban core infrastructure. Housing in city centers was protected and expanded. Policies prioritized livability. This ensured that downtowns remained active after work hours. Cities did not empty because people stayed. The American exception. The United States chose a different path. Not by accident, but through policy alignment. Zoning, highways, financing, and cultural narratives moved in the same direction. Separation, spread, speed. Other cities modernized with density. America modernized away from it. Cultural myth versus structural reality. It is tempting to attribute vibrancy to culture. Cafes, street life, social norms. But culture follows structure. When people live near each other, culture emerges. When systems separate them, culture retreats. American cities did not lack desire for vibrancy. They lacked the framework to sustain it. Choice, not destiny. There is nothing inherently American about emptiness. It is not inevitable. It is not permanent. It is the result of decisions. Decisions that could have been made differently and could still be changed. The cost of exceptionalism. Believing emptiness is normal limits imagination. It frames isolation as comfort, distance as success. But the global comparison reveals something important. Liveliness is not incompatible with prosperity. It simply requires different priorities. What was traded away? In choosing cars, separation, and spread, American cities traded proximity for privacy, continuity for convenience,
presence for efficiency. The result is not failure. It is a system performing exactly as designed. Seeing the pattern. Once you recognize these differences, American emptiness becomes legible. Empty streets are not signs of decline. They are signs of specialization. Cities optimized for movement rather than life.
The emptiness feels quiet, orderly, controlled. But emptiness is not neutral. When cities lose everyday life, the effects ripple far beyond streets and buildings. They reshape economies, social trust, and even how people understand belonging. The cost of emptiness is not always visible, but it is measurable. Economic fragility behind the calm. Dense, mixed-use cities distribute economic activity. Small businesses rely on foot traffic. Local services depend on proximity. Jobs cluster organically. Empty cities concentrate activity into narrow windows and sectors. Lunch hours replace all-day commerce. Weekdays replace weekends. Office workers replace residents. This creates fragility. When routines break through remote work, recessions, or crises, downtowns collapse quickly. What feels efficient lacks resilience. The illusion of safety. Empty streets can feel safer at a glance. Fewer people, less noise, less unpredictability. But safety in cities depends on presence. When public space is unused, informal surveillance disappears. There are fewer witnesses, fewer helpers, fewer signals of normal activity. Security shifts from community to enforcement, and enforcement alone cannot replace trust. Social isolation at scale. Cities historically countered isolation. They forced interaction, they created shared experiences, they normalized difference. Empty cities remove those encounters. People travel alone, work alone, return home alone. Even in large metropolitan regions, loneliness increases. The city becomes a network of private bubbles rather than a shared environment. Mental health and the built environment. Urban design shapes psychology. Walkable environments support routine movement and casual contact. Car-dependent environments reduce both. Isolation, sedentary lifestyles, and disconnection reinforce each other. The absence of public life is not peaceful for everyone. For many, it is exhausting. Economic segregation hardens. When cities lack shared space, economic differences become spatially fixed. Affluent areas isolate. Disadvantaged areas concentrate struggle. There are fewer places where lives overlap. This erodes empathy. Policy debates become abstract because daily experience is segregated. Infrastructure without return. Empty cities still require massive investment. Roads, utilities, emergency services. When density drops, cost per person rises. Cities stretch budgets to serve fewer people. This reduces funds for maintenance, transit, and public amenities. The system becomes less sustainable over time. Cultural life becomes event-based. In hollow cities, culture survives as programming. Festivals, concerts, pop-ups. These are not bad, but they replace organic daily life with scheduled moments. Between events, the city waits. Vibrancy becomes something you plan rather than something you live. The loss of civic identity. Cities once shaped identity. Neighborhoods carried stories. Streets held memory. When people do not inhabit places, memory fades. The city becomes interchangeable. Office towers differ little from one region to another. Without lived experience, civic pride weakens. Vulnerability to shock. Empty cities are brittle. When commuting patterns change, they have little to fall back on. Remote work exposed this weakness. Downtowns optimized for offices struggle to adapt. Places designed for people adjusted faster. Emptiness as a feedback loop. Emptiness discourages investment. Lack of investment reinforces emptiness. Retail closes, services retreat, activity declines. Breaking the loop requires structural change, not marketing. What emptiness teaches us. The American city did not fail because people stopped caring. It failed because systems removed the reasons to care. Cities thrive on overlap. When life is separated, cities hollow.
Can emptiness be reversed? What real change would actually require? By this point, the pattern is clear. American cities feel empty not because people dislike cities, but because systems make urban life difficult to sustain. The question is no longer why emptiness exists. It is whether it can be undone. The answer is complex, but not hopeless. The limits of cosmetic fixes. Many cities attempt revival through surface changes. New plazas, public art, weekend events. These efforts can improve perception, but they rarely alter structure. Without residents, plazas remain episodic. Without daily needs nearby, foot traffic fades. Urban life cannot be programmed into existence. It must be supported continuously. Bringing housing back to the core. The most effective way to reverse emptiness is also the most challenging. Allow people to live in cities again. This requires reforming single-use zoning, allowing mixed-use development, increasing density near transit, legalizing apartments in more areas. Housing is not an accessory to cities, it is their foundation. Accepting density as function, not ideology. Density is often framed as a political position. In reality, it is an operational condition. Cities need enough people to support local retail, transit, schools, public space. Without density, urban systems collapse into specialization. Reframing density as infrastructure changes the conversation. Reducing car dependence without banning cars. Reversing emptiness does not require eliminating automobiles. It requires restoring balance. Cities that feel alive offer choices: reliable transit, safe walking, functional cycling. When alternatives exist, cars stop dictating form. Space can be returned to people. Healing the damage of highways. Some cities are reconsidering their infrastructure. Highway removals, caps and reconnections, boulevard conversions. These projects are expensive, but transformative. When physical barriers fall, neighborhoods reconnect. Presence returns. Allowing streets to become places again. Street design shapes behavior. Narrower lanes, slower speeds, active ground floors. When streets feel safe and interesting, people stay. Public life follows design cues. Reforming parking requirements. Parking mandates quietly undermine density. Reducing or eliminating them allow smaller buildings, more housing, lower costs. Cities regain flexibility. Space once reserved for storage can support life. The role of time. Change will not be immediate. Urban systems evolve slowly. But cities that commit to long-term reform see compounding benefits. Each resident adds value. Each shop creates activity. Momentum builds. Resistance is structural, not cultural. Opposition to change often comes from fear of loss. Traffic, noise, property values. These concerns are real, but they are manageable. The challenge is not convincing people cities should change. It is aligning incentives so they can. The city is choice again. For decades, Americans were given one dominant option: drive, separate, spread. Reversing emptiness means restoring choice. Not forcing density, but making urban life possible again. Signs of a shift. Some cities are already changing. Downtown housing conversions, transit investments, zoning reforms. These are not trends. They are corrections. What reversal actually means. Reversing emptiness does not mean recreating the past. It means restoring the conditions that allow life to emerge. Cities do not need to be louder. They need to be lived in.
What emptiness really means. The question American cities are quietly asking. Emptiness is often mistaken for failure, but in American cities, emptiness is something more precise. It is a signal that cities have been asked to perform tasks they were never designed to handle alone. Move people efficiently, store vehicles, separate lives into manageable parts. In doing so, they succeeded, and in succeeding, they lost something essential. Emptiness as an outcome, not an accident. American cities did not drift into emptiness. They were guided there. Every wide road, every separated zone,
Every parking requirement was a choice, made in pursuit of clarity, speed, and control. The result is not broken cities. It is cities performing exactly as instructed: efficient, predictable, quiet. But efficiency is not the same as life. What cities are for? Historically, cities served a simple function. They brought people together, not just to work, not just to trade, but to encounter difference, to negotiate shared space, form collective identity. When systems remove those encounters, cities still function, but they stop meaning as much. The American trade-off. In choosing separation, American urbanism prioritized privacy over proximity, movement over presence, control over complexity. These are not wrong values, but they carry consequences. When every interaction is optional, connection weakens. When distance is effortless, place loses gravity. Emptiness as an emotional feedback. People sense when a city is not holding them. They feel it in silent sidewalks, in downtowns that disappear after work, in public spaces designed to be passed through. This is not nostalgia. It is intuition responding to structure. The question beneath the silence. At its core, emptiness asks a deeper question. Do cities exist to optimize individual freedom or to support collective life? For decades, the answer seemed clear. Now it is being reconsidered. A moment of reassessment. Remote work disrupted commuting. Housing costs challenged sprawl. Climate pressures questioned car dependency. These forces exposed the fragility of empty cities, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The system works until it doesn't. The future is not guaranteed, but it is open. American cities are not doomed to emptiness, but reversing it requires more than vision. It requires accepting that cities are not products to be optimized. They are relationships to be maintained. Life does not emerge from efficiency alone. It emerges from overlap. What would a fuller city feel like? Not louder, not denser for its own sake, just more present. More reasons to walk, more chances to stay, more moments that do not require planning. A city that holds you, even when you are not going anywhere. Emptiness as invitation. Seen this way, emptiness is not a verdict. It is an invitation to rethink what we value, to reconsider what cities are for, and to decide, deliberately, what kind of urban life we want to build next. Closing thought. American cities feel empty because they were designed to. The question now is not whether that design was wrong, it is whether it still serves us. American cities don't feel empty because people disappeared. They feel empty because daily life was designed to happen somewhere else. For decades, we optimized cities for movement, privacy, and efficiency. And in doing so, we quietly removed the reasons people stayed. But here's the real question. If cities are no longer the center of everyday life, what are they becoming? Should cities exist primarily to move us as efficiently as possible, or to hold us, even when we're not going anywhere? And if you could redesign one thing about your city, just one, what would you change first?
What we've covered in this video is just one piece of a much larger system. In the next video, we'll explore how another hidden decision shaped American cities even further. If you've noticed these patterns where you live, share your experience in the comments. And if you want to understand why American cities look the way they do, the next episode is waiting.